There's a soundtrack if you want to listen to the just insane sounds coming out of this game at any given moment.
There's a major underlying problem with this statement that heavily applies to games and anime in this day of age. Although I'm sure this statement was meant to be taken as a lighthearted joke, there's still a negative connotation that it brings to the way audio is perceived in these mediums. So let's talk about the importance of sound design for a few minutes, because I feel like the concept gets ignored quite a lot, kinda like me on dating sites. As for things like video games, movies, and anime, most often than not, sound is a very underappreciated aspect when it comes to how people develop into these immersive experiences. Usually, it's the aesthetic environments or compelling character designs that drag people into the inclusive stories and endless Twitter shitposts about how great a certain show looks. That's because of how assertive they mainly are, unlike sound where most of the time it seems like it's just passively there waiting to be recognized, with the small exception of the main soundtrack, since that's what gets most of the audience's acknowledgement. If you really think about it, how many times can you recall talking about sound over visuals with your peers during your daily anime discussions? If sound in something like a video game was stripped down to the bare minimum, how much would it really affect the immersion in a player's experience? Well, a lot actually. In fact, it would greatly affect a giant spectrum of games, and one specific game that comes to mind would be Mirror's Edge. The Mirror's Edge franchise is a great example of why sound design and audio direction is so important when it comes to crafting these types of mediums. But first, let's talk about what exactly is involved in the concept of sound design. A guy by the name of Julian Treasure did a TED Talk where he discussed his 4 major rules of sound that I think are very applicable to the process of designing sound for games or anything of the like. His 4 rules were that they need to have congruency, appropriation, value, and testament. Congruency meaning that sounds point in the same direction as the visuals, having a sense of consistency. Appropriation in the sense that sound is speaking the same language as the visuals to avoid confusion. Value to which the sound enhances and empowers the visuals. And testament in the manner of if the sound works to create the right response from a viewer. Of course, there are many more advanced and in-depth techniques and theories that could be mentioned, but I think these rules cover a suitable amount of information to how the core concept of designing sound should work. Now, the reason I bring up Mirror's Edge is because the game's sound design is one that gets praise from a lot of people for being unique and fresh. With the series focusing on a dystopian-like setting that features very minimalistic yet realistic sound, all accompanied by parkour gameplay that had never been done before and an iconic soundtrack, it exemplifies those 4 rules so extremely well to the point that the commendation it received for its sound design is so understandable. So let me explain how the series did it. Firstly, congruency. To simply put it, congruency essentially means that there needs to be consistency with the audio that is coming out to the visuals that are being shown. So take for example any first-person shooter game. If I'm sitting there with my gun right in front of me and I shoot it, I should expect the sound to come from the gun's position, not from 20 miles down the street at the Taco Bell. There needs to be a consistent harmony between the audio and the visuals to make sure that the audience understands the positioning of moving objects or people within the environment. I can't have someone talking to me face to face, but yet it sounds like they're trying to make an ASMR video. Obviously, this is an important rule to keep in mind when designing sound. Any audio that seems delayed, misplaced, or unleveled ends up disorienting the audience and breaks them out of their immersion. Because of how subconscious we become to taking in sounds, these inconsistent occurrences of congruency can really turn off some people. But utilizing that factor of the passive intake of congruent sound is something that Mirror's Edge did very well with its environmental sounds, with things like audibly muffled traffic noise coming from the streets below to the sounds of pigeons flying away as you dash past them. The congruency of the environmental sounds help support and construct a backdrop to tell a story. Not only that, but these congruent sounds can also instill psychological effects on an audience that affects how they'll reflect from an experience. Consistent sounds of footsteps slamming on the ground while you're running, the off-pattern breathing that heaves from the player as they marathon down tunnels, the sound of construction in the far-off distance. It's these types of sounds that help develop the player's connection to environments and characters. It's not so much that the sounds have to be realistic, they just need to be consistent. For realism and correctness, that lies on appropriation, as that's basically its definition. If I were to see a dog barking, I expect to hear a dog barking and not some anime girl moaning. Appropriation is a fairly basic concept that many people can easily understand, but it can become surprisingly complex, which leads to its underappreciation. Just having that dog barking may not be enough. What if it's a big dog? It'd need to have a deeper bark to really show that it really is a big dog. Not only that, but depending on how the dog barks would suggest how it's feeling. So it's not only making sure that you have the right sound matching up, you also have to take things like pitch, volume, and inflection into effect. Appropriation was done spot on in Mirror's Edge because it really needs it. Having a game based on parkour gameplay heavily relies on making sure that the sounds support the realization of parkour. Running sounds realistic. Jumping onto pipes and climbing them sounds realistic. Vaulting over fences or landing from high falls sounds realistic, and that's because appropriation lends awareness. A huge case I like to make when talking about sound is sound design between interactions. Take for example this button. If I press this button, the game will let me know that I pressed it through visuals and audio, but the game only tells me what the reaction was through audio. So if there was no audio to be played when I pressed that button, I wouldn't have a fucking idea of what I just did. Appropriation has the same case as congruency, where the sounds need to have a relationship with the visuals to ensure that there are no inconsistencies that would displace the audience, except appropriation takes more responsibility of sensibility rather than direction and positioning. The job for these first two rules are to make sure that the sounds are to be consistent, correct, and realistic. They've built the core foundation of how the sound should work, but how will it convey to the audience? Well, that comes through the rule of value. As you quickly gain momentum dodging cops during your sprints on the building tops, that sound of intense gusts of wind rushes past your face, invoking that sense of like you're moving at superhuman speeds. This type of sound utilization is the definition of what value is, the technique of manipulating your sound in order to heavily emphasize what's happening on screen. Another example in Mirror's Edge would be when you fall off of a building and you start to hear that rising high-pitched sound. That's used to emphasize that you're about to face a brutal fucking death. Value can be used in many different ways. It all depends on how it gets used. It can make waterfalls sound overly epic and loud, or it can make things sound slow and nerve-wracking. The value in the sound of Mirror's Edge is so grand because it takes the gameplay, which is already good, enhances it with its realistic and sensible audio, and makes it feel even more true to life. It takes the fundamental sounds and brings them to another level to make everything sound more worthwhile. But the most important aspect of sound design, in my opinion, is testament. This is where most games, movies, or anime get recognition for their sound. The rule of testament essentially wants to create a reaction from the audience, and they do that by forcing that reaction through the emotions in sound. A great place where you can find this is in horror games. Jesus Christ, don't do that. Stop. I'm pretty sure you all know that scenario when you're placed in a dark and daunting hallway, and as you creep closer to the end, that loud droning sound gets louder and louder, and you feel like you're about to shit your pants. That's because the sound design was modeled that way. The game knows that there's something at the end of the hallway, and they're using sound in order to build up an emotional reaction from you, all through that simple droning sound. But what about games or any other medium that doesn't include the same suspenseful theme? Well, most of that's done through the soundtrack. Of course, with soundtracks you're able to use theming with them, but they're not really limited to them. Music is an extremely complicated art form that can express any kind of emotion. A very good example of emotion in sound is in Mirror's Edge Catalyst with one of its mechanics. In Catalyst, there's a function in the game where the sound's tempo will match the player's movement depending on how fast they're moving. So if the player's running fast, you'll get some upbeat music to fit your pace. If the player's walking, you'll get more of a relaxing tone from the music. With that high tempo music, you get that sense of action and intensity, and with the slower music, you get that calm and soothing feeling. That's one of the main reasons why soundtracks are so memorable for people. Soundtracks help support the main visuals and put them at the forefront, which lets the audience become easily immersed. That's something Mirror's Edge did really well too. The soundtracks done by Solar Fields really empowered the minimalist and dystopian-like visuals of the game with its futuristic and ambient sound, and is something to be revered till this day. Voice acting is another huge component element of Testament because it serves the same purpose as a soundtrack. But that's a topic for another video. I don't want to talk about it right now, so let's keep the video going. Although the soundtracks are the component of Mirror's Edge that everyone seems to remember, just know that it did a fantastic job in conveying emotion through the smaller sounds. Kudos to James Slavin and Magnus Walterstad for crafting a sound system that was believable and easy to listen to. The next time you consume any form of interactive media, really take the time to enjoy the sounds that you're listening to because it's very easy to take them for granted. It's an entirely different experience watching anime or playing games without access to any sound. And hey, if you don't like it, you always have the mute button.